I think the best way to describe Devil Blade Reboot is as the summer blockbuster of shmups, where it is aiming to be a crowd pleaser with its strong graphical presentation and fun, approachable gameplay. And even though it isn't the deepest shmup in the long run, and it is definitely on the easier side in terms of difficulty, I think what it lacks in depth, it does make up for the most part, with pace, really engaging visuals, and solid shmup fundamentals. This is the ultimate console shmup, in other words. It doesn't have that intensity and depth of a classic arcade shmup, but like a summer blockbuster, it's a really fun time on pretty much all fronts of the genre. And so if you're a veteran player, if you're really good at shmups, it has a really fun scoring system you can dig into. And if you're a newer player, this game is pretty much catered to you because it's going to help teach you how to play shmups without being too punishing on a moment-to-moment basis. So this is the type of shmup release that I've been looking forward to for quite a while. I think the genre needs more solid, well-made crossover titles like Devil Blade Reboot, and for the most part, I am very happy with how this game turned out, and I can recommend it absolutely. But before I get into the formal review, there is some business talk I need to cover. When Devil Blade first launched, it smacked its players across the face with a really stern and frankly threatening streaming restriction agreement screen. Both the language of this screen as well as its formatting as a user-end agreement heavily indicated that failure to comply with the indicated restrictions would result in copyright strikes or some kind of legal punishment. On top of that, prior to buying the game, there is no warning or explanation of what the nature of these restrictions are and exactly what the consequences of breaking them would be. Both the Steam page and website for Devil Blade Reboot do not mention or even explain this agreement, which is shady compared to standard user agreements, which at least have some kind of lawyer talk to parse through. So what I was met with during the launch of this game was a pseudo-legal user agreement with no context or clarity. I was not pleased, to say the least, and I found the inclusion of this threatening screen and the potential copyright strikes that could result as being damaging to my impression of the game and harmful to the genre overall if this becomes a general trend with no critical pushback. So I created a video stating my concerns on the specific topic that I wanted to share before I reviewed the game because I found it to be a huge turnoff as a player. I take instances of developers leveraging copyright against their own players extremely seriously, for better or worse. Luckily, word of my concerns did reach the developer, and he clarified directly to me that the screen is essentially a very egregious localization issue, and that it's not meant as a threat to copyright strike players, but rather a request, sort of. Honestly, what the developer is trying to accomplish with this agreement screen and the constant prompts in the game is unclear, but at least the developer did respond and clarify that he wouldn't be enforcing copyright against his own players, which was my primary concern, and basically a no-fly zone for this channel. Since that point, the developer has now updated the language of the agreement screen to seem more like a request rather than an aggressive legal threat, which I sincerely do appreciate, and I mean that. Most devs wouldn't listen to a concern like this and just continue to hammer on their players anyway. Nintendo. So I made my initial video private while all this was being figured out, not because I don't think what I said isn't important, but because I didn't want outdated information without context just hanging out in the YouTube algorithm. Now that I have completed this video and the situation has been clarified with new context, you can now watch my initial response with the link in the video description. I'm keeping the video unlisted because I want it to be paired with the context of this video essentially. And in regards to the new agreement screen, I still think it resembles a user-end agreement too much, and it still doesn't clarify that the user will not be copyright struck or legally prosecuted for violating the request, which I think is essential to communicate. I think that should be made clear in the agreement itself. Also, I do not think it is fair to potential buyers of Devil Blade Reboot to not clarify what the nature of this request is, or even its existence, until after the player has bought the game and messaged the developer on Twitter. Devil Blade's website and Steam page should reference this agreement and explain its origins before the player buys the game. Because let's not forget that this request is still unusual, and I maintain that I'm not a fan of this attitude generally, and I hope that this fixation of the developer on not sharing the game's art or music online is an isolated incident rather than a start of a nasty new trend. Because like I said in my initial video, I think a core strength of video games, especially arcade games, is their social nature. I am traveling to Chicago today to hang out with people and play in an arcade, funnily enough. So content that causes streaming or video sharing restrictions, in my opinion, is not an asset. I view it as a liability. I'd rather have no soundtrack and freely stream than have a soundtrack that I can only play in isolation. After all, if this is the new standard, why even bother to put music in shmups anyway? I can just play my favorite bands as I go through the game because I can't share those online either. What's the difference at this point? Anyway, I am overall relieved that the developer has backed off the intensity of the initial agreement screen and clarified that he will not be enforcing it via legal copyright action. So this concludes this review's Business Talk section. I hope this section does not become a recurring segment because I find all this stuff pure hell. Alrighty, I will now attempt to eternal sunshine away my thoughts and concerns with the whole restricted streaming stuff, and instead focus on the overall gameplay and game design. And on that front, Devil Blade is really easy to recommend because it is doing a lot of things right, and it is doing a lot of things that I know a lot of shmup players are going to really connect with and really enjoy. And so the first aspect of Devil Blade Reboot that is certainly its standout feature is its graphical presentation. This game is doing a lot of really cool stuff. And the thing about shmups lately is that they have been kind of in a tough spot in terms of graphical presentation, where we either get shmups that are very nice and well done sprite-based stuff, but it's stuff we've seen a lot and that feels kind of like, traditional and can't really move the genre forward. And it's also very hard to compete with just the god tier sprite art of the genre in its prime, with like Cave and Mushimi-sama and just that era of sprite work or whatever you want to call it. That's really hard to compete with on the traditional front. And then we do have some 3D stuff, like we've got R-Type Final 2 and Natsuki Chronicles and so forth. But the problem with this era of 3D shmups is that the production values aren't great. A lot of the models look almost store-bought. There's not a lot of texture or grit to anything. It just has this sort of bland, it's 3D, but lame sort of aesthetic. Whereas Devil Blade Reboot manages to marry both worlds really well. It's like a PS1 era shmup like Terra Diver or something, but souped up and taken to the next level and able to take advantage of what modern graphics cards can do and stuff. And I don't think the specs for this game are high intensity or anything, but it's taking it beyond obviously what a PlayStation 1 could do. And so in terms of its overall aesthetic, I think this game does a great job of marrying and blending together its 2D and 3D elements. And it has that really nice balancing point where it's kind of hard to tell at times, wait, is this a 2D sprite or is this a 3D model? And then it's all blending together extremely well, and everything has a lot of depth. This game feels deep in terms of its visuals, like a sense of space, a sense of scale, a sense of weight. Everything is heavy and dense and chunky in the most satisfying way. When you hit enemies and they explode, you can feel the impact. There's a real visceral quality to this game's graphical style that I am a huge fan of. Another thing I really like about this game is its sense of momentum, not only in terms of its scrolling speed, but also in terms of the way it animates the enemies, the attention to detail it has, the way the bosses transition and evolve during the fights, and also even like the effects on the beams, where a lot of beam effects in shmups, even really well done ones, you can tell, oh, that is kind of just like this solid static image, PNG coming across or whatever. Like, it's got some effects, but what's great about Devil Blade Reboot's lasers is that there's a depth to them, and there's a sort of like inconsistent quality to their shape that feels very natural, and it feels very detailed and polished. Like, God knows how much time the developers spent on just the animations of the lasers, let alone the animations of all the enemies and all the little details of the sprites. It is a shame I can't show you this game's gallery because of the restrictions, because if you go into the gallery, you can get a really up close look at the detail of all the sprites, and it is really cool. But anyway, the visual detail of this game is pretty unparalleled in terms of recent releases. And another thing I really appreciate about this game's visual design is its use of the 3D space, where even though your view of the playfield is going to be fixed in a traditional shmup manner, the actual playfield itself, depending on how the stage is progressing, feels like it's like lifting and descending. You get different effects. You feel like you're progressing and moving more naturally and organically than you do typically in shmups, where in those you do feel like you're just tracking along and being pushed by the view of the camera. In this game, it does feel like the camera is following you rather than the other way around because of how nicely the game orients that sense of space and movement. And speaking of movement, that brings us to the second strength of the game, which is its pace. This game is paced extremely well, where it always feels like something is happening and you as the player need to respond to what is happening around you and what the enemies are up to. But what's unique about this game's pace and sets it apart, and I think is why so many newer players are connecting with this game, is because it's doing something that's a bit of a trick, but it's a clever trick, where the game isn't actually as intense as it presents itself. When you first play the game and you first start getting used to the game, it feels like it's just coming at you 100 miles an hour. It feels very frenetic, and it feels like, you're playing like Psycho or a cave shmup, where things are just constantly coming at you all the time. But actually, that isn't what's happening. What's actually happening is that this game's sections and levels are actually much more distinctive and broken up to little chunks or little segments, where the enemies don't end up overlapping nearly as much as you think they do. What often happens is they actually just come in, they shoot their shot. If you don't take them out, then they kind of peacefully get out of your way. But why it feels so intense and active rather than so segmented is because it coordinates and telegraphs the incoming and outgoing enemies and patterns. And that is something that I haven't seen a shmup do as well as this game does. I said at the intro of this video that this game is the epitome of console design. It is like the natural conclusion of what console design should do, because what Devil Blade does is telegraph to you the formation of the upcoming enemies and then lays those enemies in a certain style of a formation that suggests a movement, that suggests what the player should do. So in stage 1, for example, there's plenty of sections of enemies that fly in these lines, and it telegraphs to the player how these lines are going to look as they're flying in. And then you, as the player, without thinking about it, without even realizing that the game is guiding you, naturally follow the path the game wants you to do. It's really well done and clever, where it's creating the route for you. It's telling you what the route is, but doing it contextually. This is a style of stage design that new players are going to love because it removes a lot of the ambiguity that new players struggle with, that I struggled with, that we all struggle with when we first start playing the genre. Because when you first start playing the genre, it's hard to know, where do I go? Where am I supposed to be? Is this an effective strategy? Is that an effective strategy? Why am I getting walled in the corner? Because with traditional arcade shmup design, bullet hell design, the whole idea is for the enemies and attacks to snowball and build upon each other, and I love that style of design. But unfortunately, if you don't understand how this style of design works and understand that like a mistake you made 3 seconds ago, 5 seconds ago, even 10 seconds ago can end up ultimately killing you, even though it doesn't immediately kill you because of the positioning, snowballing, domino effect. That's stuff that's really hard for new players. And that's something that isn't really a thing in Devil Blade. What Devil Blade is, in terms of its level design, stage design, pattern design, is very discreet. And the strength of that is that it still makes the player move. You can't just hang out in the middle of the screen. You still need to get around and make use of the space as you're supposed to, but it's letting you catch up, and it's kind of giving you hints where to go. So it's kind of holding your hand a little bit with the way it lays the enemies out, with the way the enemies appear on screen. But it's really fun, and the hallmark of great game design is when you know the game wants you to do something, but it's still fun to do it anyway. And that's something that's very hard to pull off, especially in a genre like shmups. And so in that regard, Devil Blade is really well made in terms of its gameplay. And I think if you're a new shmup player, if you're interested in getting into the genre, if you're struggling with bullet hell, this game is going to be a great match and you're going to have a lot of fun. And I've noticed in the comments people comparing it to Treasure and saying it's the second coming of Treasure and so forth. And you can see the Treasure influence on this game, definitely. There are absolutely moments of this game where you're like, yeah, that was inspired by Ikaruga, or yeah, that was inspired by Radiant Silvergun, especially with the use of the 3D backgrounds and space. You know, Treasure were really good with that kind of thing, and this game definitely is taking inspiration from that. But I think in terms of overall feel and overall design, is actually much more like a QTE game. It reminds me a lot of stuff like Judgment Silver Sword or Eschatos or Natsuki Chronicles, especially with all the laser trails happening in this game. I mean, that's straight up a lot of Natsuki Chronicles stuff. And I would say if there's one signature feature of this game's design in terms of its bullet patterns and enemy design, is certainly its laser attacks and laser trails. And what's interesting about using so many lasers in this game, in combination with the 3D space, in combination with unique boss attacks like the bombs and the locks, is that this game at times definitely has some rail shooter dynamics going on, which I think is really cool. Not only in terms of there are like literal rail shooter attacks, like bosses will shoot incoming rail shooter style hit scan attacks, but also even just the amount of these laser attacks. They work a lot like rail shooter attacks, where in bullet hell and shmups, the signature of these games in terms of bullet patterns are lingering hitboxes. Hitboxes that appear on screen and just kind of hang out, and you've got to move around them with your ship, dodging. In this game, it isn't really that dodge heavy in the traditional shmup sense. It's more dodge heavy in a rail shooter sense, where the shot is telegraphed. You see it happening, but you dodge it at the moment it becomes active, and then that area becomes safe once again. So you have a lot more of that three-dimensional active and then deactive style dodging, versus like in a bullet hell or traditional shmup where you're weaving through corridors of hitboxes, you're weaving through patterns. In Devil Blade, you don't really weave all that much. It's more of like a timed sidestep where you see the attack coming, you anticipate it about to hit you, you move aside, you let the hitbox pass, and then you get back into position. So you have a lot more of that style dodging in this game, which is really unique and cool, and again, something that I think a lot of players will connect with. So the game has a very modern feel, and it's really well done in this approach. If I were to say the one mantra of the design of Devil Blade, it is telegraph everything. And the game excels in this regard because it is actually really memorization heavy. This game has a lot of memorization, especially when you start playing it for score. But because it is so well telegraphed and so easy to remember and identify what the game is asking you to do, it is far less frustrating than a lot of memorization heavy games because it cues you all the time. It jogs your memory and gives you that little bit of a reminder before it asks you to do something. So before you need to fly to the left side of the screen, you see the enemies coming in from the background or from the foreground, or maybe they fly in but then kind of slow down. The game is really good at coordinating the movements and the spawns and the animations and the background and the foreground and the sound effects. Basically, everything is really well synchronized together to make it stick out in your mind and make you remember, oh, I need to fly left. Oh, I need to fly right. Oh, I need to be in the center here. Everything is pushing you towards where you need to be and then reminding you you should be there. So this is really strong game design for newer players and intermediate players as well. I have to admit, as I was playing the game in hard mode and being told where to go and what to do, I felt like super good about it and super accomplished, and finished the game. And I was like, yeah, that's right. I know what I'm doing. This game is strategically designed to boost your confidence as a player. And in a genre where games are made to destroy your confidence and make you feel like a scrub and a loser, which is also really cool, I can completely understand why this game will appeal to a lot of players. It is truly that blockbuster mentality where it just feels good. You know, it isn't exactly the deepest, most challenging content you've ever come across, but it's content that makes you feel good and makes you feel good about yourself. And I mean that in the most non-ironic way possible. So this is all the strengths of Devil Blade in its core design. And this actually translates over to its scoring system as well. Its scoring system is similarly extremely clear and extremely obvious what you need to do. And the game is doing everything it can to help you through understanding and navigating its scoring system. So the scoring system of Devil Blade, I'm not going to give you a full breakdown, but just the general idea is that you point blank and kill everything like right up close. And the closer you are, the higher the multiplier will be. And then you can get into times 20. Then once you get the berserk meter high enough, you enter berserk mode, which increases the difficulty of the enemies a little bit, but also increases the score multipliers. It's very simple and straightforward, but undeniably fun. And you can tell the way the enemies were laid out, there was a lot of thought given to their layout in relation to this scoring system, because basically the way it works is once you understand how to score the game, and once you understand the enemy layouts, it's almost like you're kind of playing a racing game where you go from point to point, zooming around the screen, just point blanking things. And then there's the timeless risk reward of the closer you are, the more multiplier you're going to get, but the more dangerous it is because you have less time to react to enemy shots or movements. The more far away you are, it is safer because you have more time to react, but you get less of a multiplier. It is a classic time-old risk-reward system, but it works, and it works really well in this game, and it is undeniably fun. I sat down and played for score in the first stage and like learned the proper routing of the first stage as much as I could. And so what the game is trying to do is merge together that survival gameplay with the scoring gameplay and put them under the same umbrella. And there is actually a mode of the game which does this formally, which does this in the actual design of the game, which I am very excited about. This is something I've talked about outside of Devil Blade in, I don't know where, podcasts or somewhere. I've talked about it would be really interesting and cool and something that more shmup should consider, which is bringing in scoring into the survival as like a punishment metric. And what I'm talking about is in the highest difficulty mode of this game, it's called Inferno. It's not just that the enemies are slightly more difficult. Honestly, the enemy patterns and stuff in Inferno aren't all that much more challenging than in hard mode, and none of them are really all that challenging like in isolation from the scoring system. But what Inferno does is say, hey, if you want to stay alive, you literally have to meet these scoring requirements, like in a racing game where you need to hit checkpoints at certain intervals, otherwise you explode. Inferno is just like that. You need to keep the score multiplier or whatever it is high enough as you're going through the stages, otherwise you literally die and explode, bringing the scoring meta of the game into the survival gameplay in a very tangible, clear form. I love this idea. I think more shmups need to do stuff like this. However, I don't think the way Devil Blade does it is exactly the best version of what this concept could be, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in the critique section of the video. But in terms of positives, I really like this Inferno mode, and I really like how it is bringing the scoring to the player rather than having the player seek the scoring and kind of make up your own sort of personal goals and all that kind of stuff, which I'm not sure that's entirely effective to get people going. Like once you're in it, once you're playing for score and once you really care, all that stuff, you know, leaderboards and trying to move up on the leaderboard and all that kind of thing is very effective. But when you're just beginning and you're not really that confident in scoring, or you're not really that interested in scoring, you need something tangible in the game to make you. And I think this type of mode, Inferno mode, is a great solution to that problem. And so in terms of positives, I think Devil Blade is doing a lot right, and I can see a lot of players really connecting with this game and really loving this game. But as great as Devil Blade is, I do think this style of approachable design does come with some trade-offs in the long run, which I want to talk about in my final critique section of the video. Alrighty, now it's time for my critiques of Devil Blade Reboot. My first and biggest critique of this game is definitely its difficulty, in that it is too easy in the long run. When you first get the game and when you first start playing it, it is challenging and fun and rewarding, definitely, and it has that nice difficulty curve for newer players. But once you get familiar with the game's patterns and overall design, it bottoms out too early, in my opinion. Even if you start to play the game for score, and even when you get the hang of Inferno mode and play Inferno mode, in the long run, the core survival challenge just is not high enough. I managed to sit down and, in just a few tries, clear the survival of hard mode, and then I haven't gotten through Inferno mode, but that feels more like because I don't know the score routing of all the stages versus like the pure survival difficulty. And if you put scoring out of mind, this is something that a lot of modern shmups really struggle with, is that if you put scoring out of mind and you say, hey, I'm just going to play for survival, the game is kind of helpless against the things you can do against it, because the aspect ratio of the game, for example, is more designed and intended for lots of space to move around and lots of space to chase after enemies and point blank them. But if you abandon the notion of point blanking enemies and you decide, hey, I'm just going to kind of camp and I'm just going to kind of abuse the range of my wide shot, there's a lot of issues in terms of how much you can kind of cheese your way through the game. Like, for example, the whole battleship stage, you can just hang out on one side of the screen and let the timer run out. And even if you're not willing to sit and camp out the timer, you can just slowly snipe away at things one at a time, keeping to one side of the screen. Same thing with a lot of the boss fights, actually. If you just kind of stay on the edge of a lot of the bosses and kind of fire at them from that angle of your wide shot, they struggle to deal with that. The game overall just really struggles because of the aspect ratio and because of the more passive enemy patterns and the fact that they're so discrete and don't overlap on each other. The game is really susceptible to some good old-fashioned camping and just abusing the range of the wide shot. And so overall survival difficulty of the game is pretty low, especially with the abundant amount of resources it gives you, like the shields and the bombs. It is kind of funny how stingy the game is with extends, which is kind of an interesting phenomenon that we're seeing a lot more now with modern shmups, where a lot of like modern shmups now, in order to prevent that whole like hoarding dynamic of something like Dodonpachi, where you can gather up just a ton of resources and save them for the end of the game, which is a really good strategy in that game. Instead, the games are more like, hey, you can't hoard things too much, and the type of extra resources that we'd normally give you just become scoring items instead. I mean, it's a cool feature, and so it makes the games more consistent from beginning to end. But a trade-off of that is that it can't really have that really nasty kind of design like you get in cave games and like you get in Rising games, for example, where you get like certain notorious sections where you're like, oh my god, the Hall of Hell, or oh my god, the wall, or Ketsui's got all kinds of that. Oh my god, stage 5, like the whole stage. You know, there's sections like that in classic arcade shmups where they're just those huge spikes in difficulty that just terrorize your nightmares. But at the same time, you also feel so good when you conquer them. Like, it's a true achievement. Whereas in Devil Blade Reboot, there's really no section like that in this game. In terms of the stage design, it's all really fluid and fun and dynamic at first, but once you kind of get the hang of it, nothing's that frightening, nothing's that difficult, nothing's that scary, and it all kind of flows together a little too much. A funny contrast to this actually is the Devil Blade original retro version that they have included in this release as well. That version of the game follows a more traditional style of enemy patterns and enemy layouts and like snowballing. So there are certain sections of that game, like stage 5, where all the enemies start clustering together, their bullets overlap, you're like squished into the corner, you're like trying to wiggle your way out of these tight little corridors. Like that stage design in the end, I think is a little bit more interesting in terms of difficulty. And that's just going to be a trade-off of this game style of design. What you get for approachability, you lose in long-term difficulty to some degree. I mean, it's not like an absolute like that, but in this game, that's kind of how the way that trade-off works. Another weakness in terms of the game's design and its static nature is the boss fights. I've talked to some players who really dislike this game on the basis of its boss fights, and the problem with them is that simply, again, they're a little too telegraphed, they're a little too simple, they're a little too like, okay, the formula now, what's next? There's not enough in there. And the problem with the point blanking scoring system, and this will transition to the next critique, is point blanking as a scoring system, just raw point blanking as a scoring system, is a little too basic of a premise for scoring, because the risk reward is there in terms of survival. But if the survival difficulty isn't high to begin with, because the survival difficulty of Devil Blade isn't that high to begin with, that risk reward gets really diminished. And then you kind of get a situation with the scoring of this game where it's kind of binary. It's kind of really simple. It's like you point blank or you don't. And what you do is you just point blank harder. And it also happens that the harder you point blank, the faster you kill enemies. The faster you kill enemies, the more efficient your survival gameplay is. And so in my opinion, with the scoring system, you don't get that depth that you get in the really top tier classic shmups. This is why, as cool as the game looks on the surface, as much as it kind of evokes the Treasure aesthetic and feel, it doesn't have that deep Treasure core design like that really true longevity that Treasure games have in terms of their scoring, in terms of their level design, in terms of their ingenuity. Like Devil Blade, it's a little too simple to hold up to that standard. It's a great entry towards that standard, but it doesn't stand among the greats in that way. I'll give you a little example of what I mean, where if you go ahead and you watch like Jamer's replay of his Inferno 1cc, obviously his level of play is going to be much higher than mine, but I went ahead and did an Inferno stage 1 sort of scoring routing, and yes, of course his scoring routing is much more efficient than mine and better than mine, but there's only so much more efficient a great player can be from kind of like a mid-level mediocre player like myself, because there isn't enough depth in that game to create that real skill disparity where you watch top level Grega players, you watch top level Donanbachi players, you watch top level Ketsui players. It would take me years to even come close to that level of gameplay of what they're pulling off, where that depth in Devil Blade, because it's so straightforward, because it's so you're point blanking or you're not point blanking, and you can kind of get away with like point blanking almost everything at the max close range, because like I said, the difficulty isn't high enough to kind of prevent you from doing that, and also the enemies don't snowball together, so everything is a little too discreet and laid out to be that top tier style of shmup design. I think what Devil Blade could do that would really help its longevity and help bring it home as like a great, long-lasting shmup is it brought in one more difficulty mode. Because the problem with Inferno mode is that it's actually much more like an arrange than it is a true difficulty mode. And that is what I meant with my critique of Inferno mode, where what Inferno mode should be is actually like an alternative style of every mode, a scoring and force style of every difficulty. So you have easy Inferno, normal Inferno, hard Inferno, and then extreme or maniac Inferno. So you'd have each version would have its own Inferno mode. I think because what makes Inferno cool is that scoring requirement rule set, but that doesn't have to be its own mode. You could actually impose that rule set on various other difficulties, and I think that would be the best way to have this concept take form in the genre. And I think that is something shmups should do. Like if you bring out a shmup and you have an arcade mode, you should have this arcade scoring enforced alternative version of it, where now the players are being incentivized to score in order to stay alive. I think this is just a general concept you could apply to various difficulties rather than having it be its own isolated mode. And then with that final difficulty mode of extreme, what the developer could do is bring in extra enemy spawns on top of the already established enemy spawns, and then have more enemies linger on screen and have more things last on screen between the waves of enemies so that you have that snowballing effect. So rather than having one wave come in, launch their bullets and leave, you'll have waves come in, launch their bullets, and if you don't kill them, they like hang around, and you have enemies that linger in between the little discrete transitions of the enemy waves. Just stuff like that. Maybe have even something as simple as suicide bullets. You just basically need to have more things happening throughout the stage that tie together the different enemy waves rather than having them be so disconnected from one another. Another idea could be is having a more
presented by Qute
style rank system. I think games like Devil Blade, and I've seen more like this, where they have these discrete enemy waves. I think these types of games would really benefit from that overall rank system that increases as the game goes along, because that way the things you do at the beginning of the stage affect the things at the end of the stage more clearly. So I think a system like that could also really help. And I do know that Devil Blade has a rank system per se, where when you go into Berserk mode, it flips up to the higher difficulty. But that's a static rank system. And basically, if you're playing for score, you're basically going to be at that level of rank anyway. What would be cool is that as you continue to score and as you continue to build up that Berserk percentage and build up all those scoring attributes, the game then kicks in higher survival difficulty. That way it creates that real risk-reward incentive that is going to push apart the player skills more directly, where the higher skilled players are going to continue on that path, and then the mid-level mediocre players like myself are going to get overwhelmed and have to back off and kind of stay in that mid-range difficulty. I think a system like that would also really benefit this game in terms of overall longevity. But outside the gameplay itself, Devil Blade also has a huge oversight in the lack of a proper practice mode. Maybe if the developer wasn't spending so much time on the copyright restriction mode, he could actually put in the proper practice mode, because as it stands right now, the game has a stage select, and that's nice, but that's like basics, bare minimum. You better have a stage select. But for a game like Devil Blade, where it is so memorization heavy, and especially because the point blank routing of the game in Inferno mode is very much like chaining. It's like a more relaxed version of chaining, but it's still much like chaining, where you need to really hard memo where you need to go. There's a lot of trial and error. This game needs a very proper practice mode with multiple checkpoints throughout the stages, because it took me an hour and a half to properly route stage 1 in Inferno mode, but a lot of that time was just repeating stuff that I already knew to then get to that one section where I had to learn something, die, go back, repeat stuff that I already knew, get to that one section that I kind of know what to do, die, go back. So there was a lot of wasted time on stage resets, especially when you get to the end of the stage routing, because then you got to go through like a minute of already learned stuff every single time. And this is very precise stuff. It isn't like just the general, where do the enemies spawn? You need to know exactly where to sit, where to move, when. It's a choreographed, very precise route, which is awesome, but you need to have tools in your game to make this learning process more efficient and less time consuming. You could even say, alluding to my beginner bias video, that this could be considered accessibility, because you are helping players access the game more effectively and access the difficulty more effectively. So I already said in this review that I want the game to be harder. It's too easy, but then with the easy content it has, I want to access and learn it faster. That way I'm not repeating the same sections that I already know how to play over and over kind of arbitrarily, especially with the boss fights. That's just ridiculous. This game doesn't even have a boss select, which is bare bones minimum for a shmup. Even shmups that don't have proper practice modes like Danmaku Unlimited 3, at least they have a boss select. Devil Blade does not have a basic boss select. This seems like a huge oversight, especially in Inferno mode, where Inferno mode you need to learn how to point blank all the bosses, and to get to the bosses in Inferno mode you have to have memorized and do a nice scoring route to get to them. So for example, the stage 1 boss, in order to practice him in Inferno mode, I had to spend like half an hour constantly getting back to him through the stage runs. And then when I would get there, I couldn't really experiment all that much, because every time I would die while experimenting, I'm like, all right, that's another 2 minutes or whatever it is to get back to him. It's just ridiculous and needs to be patched. It's wasting the player's time. And speaking of wasting the player's time, enough with the stage intros in the stage select. We get it in the arcade run, you want to have these fancy cool stage intros, but why does the developer make you watch them over and over when you're doing stage select, when you're essentially trying to practice the stages? And you may think, oh, this is like a kind of nitpicky criticism. Just try it. Go play Inferno and practice 3 and 4 and count how many times you're going to get into the game, you're going to die or mess up your routing in 5 seconds, restart, which takes you back to the menu, by the way. Why isn't there a quick restart for stage select? Why don't you go right back into the stage in stage select? It can't be a loading thing. We're on the computer here with a tiny file size. Just reload to the start of the stage. Instead, what it does is you hold restart, it takes you back to the menu, you go back in through the menu, then you go through the intro transition, and then you have to repeat this every single time you restart the stage to practice, especially for Inferno mode. It's just no good. This needs to be optimized where quick restart goes right back to the start of the stage, and you don't have stage intros for stage select. You don't need them. If you want them, keep them in the arcade version, or you have a proper practice mode which removes them. Whatever it is, this needs to be improved. And so what are my overall thoughts of Devil Blade Reboot? I think this is a strong, very well-made shmup that most shmup players are going to enjoy. It is the feel-good shmup of the summer. Even the higher skilled players, I think they're going to have fun with it for a time that might not last for years like it does with, the true classics of the genre. But still, you're going to have fun with it while you play it, especially because of the graphics and visual presentation. And if there's something to really learn from this game and something that this game is bringing that's new and cool to the table, it is its use of 2D and 3D and how well it marries them together visually, and also how well it coordinates and visually represents its enemy patterns. I think all shmups could learn quite a bit from that, and just like the depth and weight of the presentation overall just knocks it out of the park. I do think it is a little too generic in terms of its visual theming. Like, if you put down on paper the most standard shmup theme possible, I think Devil Blade follows that pretty much to a T. But because the visual design is so strong, it still manages to stand out. So now it's like the standard looking shmup that other standard looking shmups, I guess, will be measured up against. I do wish it was a little bit more creative and a little bit more out there. Again, something that sets Treasure apart from this game, because looking at the visual presentation of Treasure is just always so instantly recognizable and identifiable, even between their different games. Like Ikaruga, nothing looks like Ikaruga. Radiant Silvergun, nothing looks like Radiant Silvergun. This game looks like a lot of shmups, just like a better version of a lot of them, and I respect it. I just wish it was a little bit more unique, a little bit more identifiable in terms of its theming. But there is no denying that this is a very compelling entry into the genre, and the type of shmup I think a lot of players have been waiting for. And I think it is the type of shmup I would like to see come out on a more regular basis. Not that all shmups should be like this, but just something to come out every year that kind of gets the general audience engaged, gets people talking and excited. Something that is approachable but still well made and acceptable. I do think it is important to have games like that come out in a genre on a regular basis to keep the general audience engaged and having fun, because if you're only getting like the most high level, unique, out there games like Hellsinker and so forth, those are awesome, but you need something a little bit more relatable to cross the bridge for new players, and I think Devil Blade does a fantastic job at that, and I think that is what it is aiming for. So if you like this video, please like, subscribe, tell all your friends, and also check out my Gunvein Expert 1cc developer commentary with Boghog. I'm assuming you're a shmup fan if you've gotten to this point of the video, and that is a video that I think is really cool, not only to talk about the expert mode of Gunvein, but also to talk about it with Boghog, the developer of the game. So I really wish more people would check that video out, so please do if you're so inclined. Adios, everyone.
So thank you to the $5 patrons: 100, Absconditis, Accepting Panda, Admiral Coconut, Anhold, AJA, Alexander Pfeiffer, Anthony A, Arcade Hell, Arrow Viper, Owleye, Autonamed, Beelit, Beam Pit, Bo, Beto Dames, Boghog, Board Basmati, Borgie22, Chase Palumbo, Chris Yusufovich, Christopher R, Chronic Burnout 3, Clara Cliff, Clay Binkley, Climby Coyote, Coast, Colorboy, Cooksan666, Cook Some Soup, Des Audio, Dances with Incels, Darren Griffin, Dave Hansen, David Crespo, Delta Tango 6, Dick Jones, Dingo, DJ420 Praise It, Drano, Dr. Bosky, Elias Alonso, Eric Houdini, Fabra, FCK, F Deluxe, Friskin, Florida Sucks, Frames Per Human, Francisco, Full Set, Game Boy Guru, Geese Machine, GPM, Gustavo Sanchez, Hausu, Hero Death, Kiki Hime, HUD, Jake Ryan, Jacob Valenzuela, JLab, JBRPG, Jink Hans, John Kelly, John Longwalker, Josh Mayer, K, K2, Contain, Craze the Boys, Mieshma, Malaise, Mario Simic, Mars Bar, Matt O'Leary, Maz, Megadeth 859, Minung, Meister, Mewgem, Milo Shamel, Misha, Munro, Nathaniel Davis, Neon Dagger Games, Neela Agitis, Okla Kugels, Ospe, Pedro Perez, Poorly Written Protagonist, Psycho Blizzard, Queen Charlene, Ralph Tuhilo, Raul, Rapido, Real Skeen, Ren Halt's Time, Retro Schmupper, Rory Starks, Rolf015, Ryan Bartlett, Scanline City, Segfault, Shazzy, Shmup Junkie, Sirapong, Sky2K, Spiders STG, Steady AI, Steve Fiction, Street Magic, Superfunk, Temzarian, Taze Ryu, The Boot Rex, The Dirty Screech, The N1, The Old Bensta, Toho Rosardi, Travis Arbon, Sugumo, 2IU, Twilight EX, Unikoi Roots, Ursua, Ushi Mushi, Vic Viper, Beautiful, Wabby Legs, What Is This, Zachary Patton, and Zeal.